And we should be good to go, I believe. So what's up, you scholars of enlightenment? A clip of comedian Jon Stewart on Stephen Colbert has been going viral over the last couple of days because he said a few things about the COVID-19 pandemic that apparently you're not supposed to say. So I've watched it, and I have to say, I think in a couple of ways it's quite useful and interesting, and in other ways it's pretty fucking tragic. But we're going to break all that down. And to help me do that, I brought along my friend and colleague, Dr. Philipp Markolin. Philipp, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure, buddy. It's always a pleasure to chat these things through with you. So Philipp is a former data analyst and biologist at ETH Zurich, which is a long-winded way of saying he knows a lot more about viruses and biology than I do. So it's good to have him along for this stream. So Philipp, I wanted to bring you in on this video. And we're going to play it through and just sort of stop and, say whenever you want to stop and give some of your thoughts. You've seen this clip and I've seen this clip. And I think before we start, there's sort of three ways of looking at it, if you'll allow me. I think in one way, it's just comedy. The guy's like screaming, he's ranting. It's supposed to be funny, I guess. Like, I thought it wasn't funny because I think people just screaming and jumping around is like the easiest way to try and sort of make people laugh. But look, that's subjective. It's comedy. It's a comedy show. So who gives a toss what was said? It's just for fun. So if that's your take on it, fair enough. I think there's a second way of looking at it, which is there seems to have been a change in atmosphere around the lab leak hypothesis. Now, a lot of scientists still think it's less likely than the zoonotic, the animal jump hypothesis, but there was a sense that because Trump said it and Trump supported it, that it wasn't studied properly. We've had the letter in Science recently, which I can bring up for people to see on the stream, where a lot of scientists were saying that, look, this hasn't been studied properly, it needs to be looked at properly, especially in a world where we've got a lot of gain of function research going on. We have seen lab escapes in the past, like foot and mouth. This is a hypothesis that whether it was true or not in this particular instance deserves to be treated seriously and taken seriously, and not just have 4 pages out of 300 in the latest WHO report. So I think it was useful in that sense of breaking down the idea that you can't discuss this or that it's not allowed to be discussed. I think that was quite a useful case. And then there's a third way of looking at it where if you take the things at face value, which I think some actors have done, the science is kind of pretty tragic. So what did your takeaway from, you've seen this clip a couple of times before we sort of go into a couple of the arguments that are made. How do you feel about those delineations, and what are your initial takes?
Yeah, so I think you're right. You can always say it's just comedy. And I mean, I used to watch Jon Stewart when he had the Daily Show. I liked usually his takes on things. Sometimes, comedy, it's hit or miss, right? And for me, I
do it, so I know you can miss, right? It's the most awful thing when you do miss. So
yeah,
the last thing I want to do is
something like that might have happened here a little bit. I don't think you have to overanalyze it if you miss your comedy. However, I think what can be discussed is also then the effect that it has when somebody when you do satire or when you do serious commentary in a humoristic frame, how that impacts and moves the whole discussion forward, basically, and what happened after. So it's definitely worth looking why it went viral and what can be said about that.
Yeah, it's good to see. I put it up on the board there, viral clip going viral, which, no pun intended, but that seems to have been what's happened. It's been picked up very widely and taken forward by a lot of people with a lot of different views. So maybe if we just start off by playing the first bit of this. So it's about a 30-second clip, and then maybe if we can get your thoughts on it. Just let me know if you can hear it as well.
It's the exact same.
How do you feel about the science
hear that?
now?
Well, so I will say this.
No, actually
No.
I can't.
Okay, so I need to share this with you, and so it will take me 1 second to share this through Skype and make sure you have a proper connection to this. So if I share my screen with you and share the computer sound, you should be able to see it now.
Yeah, now it's perfect.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Right, so about a 30-second clip.
It's the exact same.
How do you feel about the science now, though?
So I will say this. I honestly mean this. I think we owe a great debt of gratitude to science. Science has, in many ways, helped ease the suffering of this pandemic, which was more than likely caused by science.
Right, so that's the first sort of one that I wanted to stop on. So, great debt to science. Science has helped a lot with this pandemic. Nobody's going to argue with that. We can argue about some of the science communication and how well that's gone, but the vaccines are basically a miracle of medical science and how well we've done with that, and that's helped ease the pandemic significantly. But then he goes a little bit further than that, and says that it was most likely caused by science. Now, again, on one level, maybe it's just a joke.
Yeah, so if it's just comedic exaggeration, then actually it's funny, right?
Yeah,
so you
exactly.
saw me chuckle there a little bit because it's like, often scientists are perceived as all holy and thou, and sometimes scientists cause problems for themselves, and that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
And in this particular case, I feel like what happened after kind of puts this in a different light than this one-liner itself.
I think that's fair. I think what is more interesting with this is not actually what he said, it's how it's been taken by other people. So it's been taken by a lot of people to say, look, this was just an obvious thing. So you see people running off with this. So you'll see people running off and saying like, John Stewart is just dropping truth bombs. He's not wrong. John Stewart is just saying the obvious thing. So it's more interesting about how this has been taken outside of what he said than what he actually said. So I don't think slamming on John Stewart is necessarily the right thing to do. But what is interesting is the way it's been taken. So that comment that it's the most likely, most obvious thing, well, it bears saying that that's not the view of most scientists. And even the scientists that are wary of the downsides of publishing or of publicizing the lab leak, so the idea that it might cause Asian hatred or it might alienate China and we can't discuss things with them and all these kind of things, most of them are pretty open to the idea that this hypothesis needs to be taken very seriously. But I think the dangerous point that's happened, I'd like to get your thoughts on this, is that this change of atmosphere, the fact that Trump's gone, the fact that we feel like we need to discuss this hypothesis, I think in many people's mind has suggested to them that the evidence has really shifted, that the lab leak has become much more likely, that there's some sort of smoking gun has appeared. And that is not the case from the evidence that I've seen.
Yeah, so you're exactly right. So, although it was kind of forbidden to talk about the lab leak in the Trump era because he said, China virus and then
China will pay and
exactly, and then the whole cascade started with their own narrative. But on the scientific level, lab leak was investigated basically from day one, just by checking what is the genome. Is there any elements in the genome we can discern? Is there something if there would have been a smoking gun in the genome right there, some sign of engineering, it would have been known from day one, and people have been looking into that, right? Because the moment something starts like that, and everybody is taken over, there's tens of thousands of scientists all pursuing their own little research area, little niche, and try to be faster than others, to be better than others, to find a hypothesis that others haven't worked on. So it's not true that scientists were not working in it. However, what happened?
We scientists are a very competitive bunch, even though we value the collaboration. We always want to get there first as well if there's an amazing discovery to be made.
And however, what happened is that the amplification was very one-sided from the very beginning as well, because the moment Trump wanted to deflect blame and saying it was all China, then the narrative in the media was only putting scientists that said it has to be zoonotic jump, it has to be a natural origin, and lab leak has been discarded and a conspiracy. And this narrative is outside what actually was the factual statements in science, because scientists never said, the evidence was just not there. The evidence, accumulates, and from beginning to end, the scientists never discarded lab leak, but also there was never strong conclusive evidence saying there is a lot or a high probability of lab leak.
I think that's really important to make that delineation between science and the media, because it's quite obvious the media were like, oh, I don't really want to discuss this, Trump. And in science, it was never really off the table. I think there were some noises. We've seen the CDC director came out recently and said, there was quite some murmuring in science. People didn't really want to talk about it. I think there was a little bit of a stench of people didn't really want to talk about it because it was it was perceived as such a low probability hypothesis, but it was never fully off the table.
That's the one thing. And the other thing is nobody wanted to kind of, jump into this controversial and political era as well, right? In the beginning, if not need be. Why would you need to jump in there? You just do your research. You don't have to publicize it and go out of your way to make enemies in high places, right? That's the other thing.
Well, you're right. And I think this is what most scientists did. They probably were a little bit under the radar and just kept looking into it. There is, of course, it is very important to say that looking at these lab leak hypotheses is incredibly important, not just, even if it's unlikely in this individual case, there's a wider context of, increased knowledge of how we do things in biology, new techniques. Gain of function research has been very, highly looked at in the media. And the potential for a leak from a lab to occur with deadly consequences is something that we do now need to contend with more. So not just in this case, but there's a wider context to taking lab leaks seriously. And I think that's maybe what got lost. That in this case, there's no solid evidence as yet of a lab leak, but scientists are wary that we do need to take these things very seriously. So if you look at, for example, the science letter that came out from the scientists who were saying to investigate the origins of COVID-19, a lot of what they say is not really saying, we think lab leak is most likely. They're saying that one of them hasn't been treated as thoroughly as it might necessarily be. And we need more evidence to be able to fully rule out this lab leak and take it seriously. So I think people are getting the wrong end of the stick, that people, and maybe this is a normal human bias, we've discussed this before, that when you see two options, you immediately think 50-50.
Yeah.
They must be roughly 50-50. These are two competing hypotheses. And yes, they are two competing and very important hypotheses, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they're 50-50. One could be 5%, one could be 95, 99, 1. It doesn't matter. Or there could be other hypotheses that come in. But I think what's happened over the last week, especially with this, has been that people now feel, because the atmosphere has changed, as we just said, that the evidence has moved in that way, and these things are really in tension with one another, whereas they're still zoonotic jump is still very much the sort of lead hypothesis.
So it's kind of an availability bias, right? Because at first people didn't hear about it, especially people that were not in the scientific community, were not involved in looking at this. They never heard about it. They never heard that, all the arguments that are brought forward by, this Nicholas Reid article or some others, they've been a year old. I've heard about them, in April 2020, right? So it's not, and back then I thought, I was in the camp that said, lab leak might be more likely than people think, just because from my working experience in the lab, a lot of things can go wrong. People can, inject viruses by accident into themselves when trying to inject mice. They throw a vial in the wrong trash. The cleaning lady takes it out, throws it on the depot, and then, something happens, or an animal escapes from the facility. There's a million things that happen in the lab. There's many anecdotes that I have. And so for me, thinking that, if they really had, worked in a lab, could be that just by accident, something happened there. So I never discarded it. And especially then when all the stonewalling from the Chinese government came, and, no real new evidence came for a long time on the zoonotic jump hypothesis. At some point I was like, maybe it's a 50-50 almost, right? But I think now that more and more people start considering and are allowed to openly state all the evidence they have for each case, also because the narrative has changed, now seeing that there's so much more evidence for the natural origin than there is for the lab leak, the probability now shifted back down, and it's very unlikely that this specific release was a lab leak versus zoonotic origin.
I think it's very important to draw that that distinction, isn't there? There's a difference between saying the hypothesis is still open, even if it's a low probability, and should be taken seriously, especially in the wider context of lab leaks, and saying that it doesn't need to be 50-50 to be taken seriously. And I think that's what people have mistaken, that potentially it wasn't being taken seriously enough, but that doesn't mean that it was ever highly probable. And I think that's where people have...
I mean, it's it's a bit like, okay, maybe it's not 50-50, but what it's 90-10, you know? It still means that, you know, given enough opportunity, we will get lab leak pandemics in the future. So in the end, we have to investigate how to prevent them. And
if it's 5%, you're going to have 20 of these, you're going to get one. So, you know, it's something that needs to be discussed.
And I mean, we get pandemics all the time. I mean, if you think just past the 2000s, we had SARS-1, we had MERS, we had Ebola, right? And now we have SARS-2, right? It's like we already had 4 pandemics, and just because 3 of them didn't reach catastrophic proportions, people just forgot about it. But in the end, SARS-CoV-1 could have been very dangerous as well, but it was contained a bit easier through luck as well, right? And MERS we were lucky as well that we caught it, and we figured out that it quickly came from camels and got rid of the camels, and you know.
Well, MERS wasn't the death rate from MERS significantly higher than from SARS-CoV?
Exactly. That's why we caught it so quickly, right? If something kills a lot of people very quickly, the alarm bells raise more than when some people start coughing and most of them don't have anything, and only some people develop complications and pneumonia and then die of that, right? So it's a very sneaky virus, SARS-CoV-2, in that regard, to catch it early. Others, we were a bit luckier, but that doesn't mean that in the future it will always be like that, one way or the other.
Why do you think we've talked about a couple of the reasons with the sort of with Trump having gone and it being seen as sort of more palatable in the media and it getting emphasized? Do you think there are any other reasons why this lab leak has sort of been, I don't know how to explain it, it's sort of over the last couple of weeks been re-energized? There was a period of it last year where people started talking about it. Trump took it up and then everyone just sort of said no, and now it sort of has come back over the last couple of weeks. Is there any other sort of geopolitical reasons why you think this might have come up? Obviously, we had the letter from the scientists saying to cover it more clearly after the WHO report came back with, I think it was 4 pages out of 300 only to lab leak. So there was some push in science. Do you think there are other sort of geopolitical reasons why this has become more palatable?
For sure. I mean, if any narrative on a global scale starts blowing up, you can count on national and transnational actors to kind of take advantage of that in whatever way they can, right? And also shape that narrative or support sources that promote that narrative in a million ways, right? And clearly there seems to be a more geopolitical constellation, West against China, that has been roaming in the background, and now
I guess that
more
explains,
and more prominent.
or at least goes some way to justify as well. People will say, look, China is stonewalling. They didn't let these people in to look at the labs.
Exactly.
Certain vials or samples that they didn't have access to. But then I think if the roles were reversed and it was a load of Chinese investigators coming into America, would they be as open to show all of their files and their labs? And I don't think they would.
You look how the US treats their own people with transparency, right? Most people have no chance to get any insight into what their government or even other companies or whatever are doing. So I doubt that the US, if there was indeed a bio leak in the US somewhere, they would let in the Chinese investigators. Even if there wasn't a leak, they wouldn't let them in just because, they think the Chinese would just, make up some data in order then to credibly claim the narrative that the US caused it. And in fact, it was just, an accident, or it was just a natural event that happened to happen where it happened. So
there's all sorts of political leveraging going on around it. Yeah.
So I think this is a big part of why this narrative came back. Another part, I think, is more psychological, meaning that now that, the pandemic, the acuteness of the pandemic kind of starts lifting off in the West, and people now can look back and see, what we went through this big ordeal, and grief and suffering and all that stuff. People then start to try to figure out, what was the problem? I don't want to go through that again.
Yeah.
And a narrative like, we could have prevented it if just we had control over the scientists or the lab leak is more attractive psychologically than, we would have to stop invading animal territory all over the world in order to minimize our chance that there's a zoonotic spillover. It seems way more easy a fix just saying, stop the research in gain of function, stop the biolabs, virus research, just, do that two things and we will not have this problem again, is a way more attractive narrative psychologically and thus more viral and spreading more easily than the more nuanced, we are not treating nature very nicely, we increase human-animal interaction so much that sometimes something can jump over. So,
that's a really interesting idea, that this is just a cleaner solution, because obviously we're pattern seeking animals, probably putting the idea of agency into actions. The classic example that people give is, if you think that the rustling outside the cave is the wind, you don't go out and investigate, the snake bites you and you die. But if you put some agency to it, or it's the snake that's rustling the grass, then you survive. So this is the classic, sort of example that's given.
Or if you mistake a tree for a lion, right? If you get it wrong, nothing happens. But if you get it wrong, the lion bites you. But if you're misjudged, nothing happens.
So I think that's a really interesting point, that this is more psychologically persuasive and more easy on the psychology. I also think just simpler. There's so many, I think when people look into and I've been discussing it in detail with you this week, and thinking about all the things that have to happen between the jump from an animal and the mutations that occur, I think it's just easier for people to say it's one thing and go from there. So I think that's actually quite a nice roundup. I think there's a lot of reasons why this has come back.
And also there's an kind of how should I put it, kind of a redemption for all the people that were like on the Trump side, and he makes evidence-free claims, right? And now something comes back. Of course, there's an amplification from this redeeming aspect of, my hero person had his opinion and he was right all along. But I mean, it doesn't matter when a person says something without evidence. It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. It's without evidence and not based on anything.
That's a really interesting point that you've raised as well, because like anything, and this has been one of the problems that scientists have sort of called out with this, the politicization of it that always seems to happen with any important issue, is discussing it with nuance and being in the middle. It doesn't really work in the media. I saw a comment on the stream from AB, and he's saying the lab leak is easier to sensationalize, and I think that's right, because it's become, are you on this side, you believe it, or are you on this side, you don't believe it? The nuance in the middle is not so good for shifting newspapers or getting your clicks and likes on Facebook. It's better to be simple and clear and definitely on one side. And it's also, as you said, it's sort of skewed by politics. So, Trump was on the right with the Republicans and the other side is on the left. And people tend to try and break it down into those simplistic tribes rather than potentially looking at the evidence dispassionately. So I also think this is modulated, and I'm sure this is something that you'll be on because you discuss this all the time, that the media incentivization or incentives that we have and the social media incentives that we have tend to cause this simplistic bifurcated narrative again. And as you say, once one side starts to seem to get a little bit of a window back, it's like, aha, we can now bash on the other side again.
Exactly, right. I mean, this is what it's been used. I think this clip also on the right has been used mostly to say, screw you liberals that told us we were crazies. Trump was right all along. Even Jon Stewart says it now, right?
Here we go. Here's a link from Ben Shapiro, for example, who's a very prominent right-wing commentator, and it's just very simplistic. And I'm very disappointed in that, actually, because I don't think he's as evil as some people think he is. But I think that is a very poor take on it. And then some here who are quite right wing in the UK podcast of the Lotus Eaters just saying this was incredibly obvious. So they've run off with it as a chance of just, like you said, it's a redemption narrative, right? Mm-hmm. We weren't wrong in the end because it now seems to have come back. Well, it doesn't mean that it's right necessarily. Yeah. So I think that's actually quite a nice overview of this has come back for many reasons, political and other reasons that are wider. The media, for example, that are wider than the science. The science hasn't really shifted much on this topic. And if anything, as I'm going to discuss in some videos with Philip over the next week or so, it actually might have moved a little bit against the lab leak hypothesis. And there'll be more on that to come. The two-strain hypothesis, for example, that we talked about. So I want to move on from that because there's one more main point that I'd like to discuss in this video. So if I can put it back up, and I think if we can go to, yes, it's just over the next little bit.
Perhaps there's a chance that this was created in a lab. There's an investigation.
A chance?
Well, but
oh my
if
God.
there was evidence, I'd love to hear it.
There's
I just don't
a novel respiratory coronavirus overtaking Wuhan, China. What do? Oh, you know who we could ask? The Wuhan novel respiratory coronavirus lab. The disease is the same name as the lab. That's just a little too weird, don't you think?
Now, this is the other main argument which is made in this piece. Yeah. Any thoughts on that? The lab is the same name as the place, and it's obvious. Thoughts?
So the problem with obviousness is that, we are lacking a lot of information usually. If you have 2 dots, it's very easy to make a connection. If you have 20, it's a bit more difficult, right? And in order for this to be a bit less obvious, one has to know first, where do respiratory diseases come from? SARS-1, the original SARS, came also out of there, and the lab was established after that to study exactly this viral zoonotic jumps that happens from bat and cause respiratory diseases. So it makes sense to establish a lab where these things actually happen, right? This is, just because something is correlated.
So I brought up a nice little picture from you, which is an overlap of the number of ice cream sales against the number of shark attacks. Yeah. And obviously it shows a nice correlation. Yeah. The problem is
a great one from I think maybe 30 years ago where they correlated coffee consumption with lung cancer like perfectly. And you're like, oh my God, what's going on there? And then they realized, probably it's because all the people going on coffee break from the time when they studied it in the 50s, they were all going smoking when they were going on a coffee break. So obviously.
Exactly.
There's a reason, a very obvious reason for that.
So there's a reason that what I find interesting about this clip, and this seems to be the thing that people are taking away. Oh, he's just saying the obvious. Of course it's obvious. The point about science is that a lot of things seem obvious because we have evolutionary mechanisms to help us get to assumptions quickly that we need to operate in the world. But often they don't orientate us towards truth. So in this case, yes, it seems obvious. There is a lab there that says Wuhan coronavirus lab. And that means that checking that it didn't come out of that lab is obviously a sensible hypothesis. The lab leak hypothesis is sensible. What's not sensible is that he then goes on to say it therefore makes it very likely. You're falling into that correlation versus causation. You actually have to actually check that. And as you said correctly, the issue here is that the lab is actually there because we had the SARS-CoV-1 outbreak in 2002. And this whole place is completely awash with coronaviruses. So if you're going to set up a lab anywhere to study coronaviruses, you set it up there in a massive city of 11 million people with all the transport links and things that you need to get around. And there's the mystery sort of has disappeared. So
you also know that, for example, these people, right, they interact also with the environment. They have to go and get bats and bat samples. And maybe they even have bats in the lab, right? All of that makes a lot of sense when you study it.
And this is what sort of upset me about this clip. Again, if you're just saying it's comedy, fine. But if you're taking it seriously, he started off by saying science is very important. We need science. Science is great. And he's just sort of thrown the whole scientific method out of the window and said, well, certain things are obvious. We don't really need it. If you look at the geography in the world, where are all the dengue fever labs? They're in Latin America. They're in Brazil. They're in Africa. Where are all the Ebola labs? They're in Africa. Because why would you put them somewhere else and have to transfer everything away from the source? I mean, they still have labs in America that do these things as well. But the vast majority of the labs on the ground and mobile labs, for example, are where the damn thing is.
And there's also an exchange between the labs, right? For example, the MRC in Great Britain, right? They have labs in South Africa and former colonies study infectious diseases, right? And then they collaborate also with the main campuses in Cambridge, but also, they're getting their samples and their original virus sequences or bacteria or whatever, they get it from the local population, and the treatment or the clinical trials or whatever they're doing where the people actually suffer from malaria, from dengue fever, from God knows where, right? So you always have to have certain outposts somewhere, right? And for viruses, it's not that different. So it's not surprising. And that's why the Americans were also involved in the Wuhan Institute and funding them, because they were also interested in doing their research on these potential pandemic viruses, and they wanted to have a leg in there in order to gain more
they wanted
knowledge.
to be on the scene, so they had to be involved with the lab which is located where you can get the sample.
Yeah, but you don't need a conspiracy for that, right?
Here.
It's just,
It's what I found incredibly. I mean, we've had sort of in-depth discussions over this over the last couple of days. What I've actually found amazing is a lot of the arguments that were put forward for lab leak. This furin cleavage site and the fact that it's so transmissive in humans and stuff. They seem very convincing on the surface, no doubt about that. Because you look at it and you go, oh yeah, that is a little bit odd. Until you start to look at the reasons and the science underneath. And they're actually all very, very easily explainable, which we're going to go into in other videos, looking at the arguments for and against. But I'm surprised that they've got so much traction. It's the Wade example for the article for Nicholas Wade that you talk about. I've seen it on multiple channels. Brett Weinstein saying some of the same arguments. Yeah. And when you search into the arguments, they're actually really, really bad arguments. And I'm surprised that they've got so much traction. Maybe it's, again, that people who aren't versed in the scientific method, a lot of these arguments look plausible and sensible on the surface.
There are two things, right? First, unfortunately, we have to think about human psychology, and the narrative that people understand is the narrative that will win, right? And
by the way, before I don't mean to cut you off again, just to say I'm not calling anyone out on this. To me, they seemed very plausible until I dug into the science and talked to you, who knows a lot more about it than I do. So that's not digging people out and saying people are stupid. It's saying some arguments are very attractive until you start to sort of look a bit under the surface.
Exactly. So the issue you have is always, if you have somebody that is a journalist or a very good communicator, can break down scientific sounding ideas into something that people can digest and understand. And I mean, Nicholas Wade did that to a certain extent very, very well, right? He used some specialized vocabulary, but then explained, the likelihood is very low and this is so uncommon. And then he has a good metaphor for it, right? And then people feel like, yeah, that doesn't sound that it's coincident. That doesn't sound like this could happen naturally. And this is just because if you ask the top virologist in the world like Christian Drosten, what he thinks about that, and then he starts talking about models and blah 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 and Bayesian reasoning, then people are like, what? So it's just sometimes it's easier to take something up just because somebody explains it in a way you understand, but that doesn't make the arguments themselves more or less scientific or strong. I mean, the arguments have to be based still on or judged based on what is their value and their truth, and not.
It was interesting that just in passing that Nicholas Wade article, I found it in it's in like nuclear physics or something, which I found bizarre. And that's probably, as you mentioned, because it went to a biology journal or whatever, and they went, "Get the fuck out of here! What's this?" Like, it's just garbage. So this discussion turns up in nuclear physics or whatever it was. But
I mean, even in our lab, we do better. My old lab did biomedical informatics. This article was linked, and we were having a discussion. It's like, what do you think about this? And then it doesn't seem reasonable that he assumes, this low odd probabilities, because you can easily get, this the necessary sequences in just by natural things. Viruses do that, right? So it was just, one Slack conversation, and people were like, yeah, okay, fine. That was kind of the hardest argument he had when it comes to scientific. The rest is more like, the Chinese don't tell us anything. The WHO gets paid by the Chinese, and then Fauci and Darfsak, and these are not scientific arguments. This is just, political arguments.
It's a bad smell, isn't it? There's some bad smell about it, and then you can link some simplistic arguments to it, and then if you really want to look hard enough, you can sort of see what you want to see, but there's no real hard evidence under the surface there. And we're going to dig into that a bit more in some videos that are coming. So Philipp, I don't want to keep you for too long, because we discussed this a lot this week and I've taken up a lot of your time. Why do you think, final question or final point that we can discuss, why do you think that people are going to celebrities, to Jon Stewart, for information about a complex topic like this? Why has this blown up? Why have we not just said, it's a guy doing comedy, doesn't know anything, move along? Why is this blown up so much? What is your biggest takeaway from that?
I think it's for the same reason as everything else, right? I mean, we humans, the world is too big and complex to have an opinion about everything. And so we look up to people we admire or we think highly of and just adopt their opinion, because it's easier to adopt somebody's opinion about something than just forming your own opinion, right? Getting through the footwork of, like you did with me, right? Collecting all the evidence, looking at
I'll tell you, Philipp, that was hard work, because I realized, and it wasn't because you didn't explain it brilliantly and I didn't really enjoy it. I did.
No, because
it was because I realized how little I knew.
Yeah.
And how much I'd found these arguments convincing. But I don't want to say it like I'm patting myself on the back, but I'm proud of myself for taking that time and not just throwing something out there that seemed, that people would have put a load of ticks on, because it would have been wrong. And it's hard to do that work, right? It's hard to realize that you don't know anything.
Exactly. So I think this is a big part of the reason. Is just, and also we have this weird assumption that people that are, getting a lot of attention are experts, that people that are very confident are right. I mean, these are common psychological biases that we have. And, in this social media area, this just feeds into it, right? So everything that's popular, everything that's, everybody, any person that is very popular gets conflated with being an expert in something. And everybody who's admired
Taylor
gets
Swift,
a followership.
What does Taylor Swift think about the deficit or whatever?
Yeah, exactly.
Who cares?
But those things happen, right? I'm sure if you would Google it, somebody would make an argument for that, right?
No, I think that's a very good point. I also think, obviously there's a lot of motivated reasoning going on, and we sort of chatted about this a little bit yesterday, that when you can't find the answer that you want coming from a large group of biologists, then you turn to wherever the hell else it might come from. And in this case, it's a very well-known comedian with a big platform on a big show, a show which usually puts out, to be fair, sort of more left-leaning ideas, and that has
propaganda.
Been, in this case, more accurate maybe on the lab leak, but perceived as a left-leaning idea. So people can jump on that and say, aha, now here's someone finally coming out and pushing against the narrative, and being a freedom fighter and speaking truth to power and all this sort of stuff.
I still think, deep down, that he intended the comedy to go a bit different, because he is so simplistic in this narrative that it seemed to me like satire. Like, he wanted to critique that people jump to the quickest conclusions based on nothing but, geography or, a name even, right? And then in the end, he had this weird interaction and said, I was lonely and then I saw the name and that's why it made sense to me. So for me, that's the satiric aspect of saying, actually he is criticizing the whole thing. If that is indeed the case,
it's quite clever.
I think it was quite clever and it was missed. It was missed. And the other thing, I don't agree with him, because when he does it like that as a satire, that clearly then shows that, only simpletons would believe in lab leak, which is clearly not the case either, because there's plenty of scientists and plenty of smart people that have said and are seriously considering what are we doing in our labs, what are the protocols we have, and how likely are certain leaks to happen. And
It's interesting that you say that, actually, because that would fit in more with that narrative that people tend to say, if you think about these things, you're stupid or racist or, in some way deficient. So maybe you're right. It would sort of fit more with what you would have expected to hear on that show.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, that's interesting, actually.
So this is one thing. And then obviously he did it poorly, right? This is why I think maybe the joke gone wrong, because clearly some people took him too literal, and then the right wing went with it, and you're like, okay, maybe that was not his intention, or maybe he wanted something all together in between and say, then if the name is that obvious, start investigating there, which is a fair thing to do. But then then he said a lot of simplistic things after, so I'm not sure. It left me confused, and in the beginning a bit like,
that's never good with a comedy, right? You don't want to. The worst thing you want them to feel is confused.
So either he missed the comedy, or he has an opinion that is wrong. So I don't know what.
So one of the two. But we don't want to be too harsh on comedians, because I miss as well. But you're right, because it's really interesting, actually, if you look under the comments for like the Stephen Colbert late night. A lot of the times you look underneath and it'll be like, oh, unfunny, leftist comedian bashing on people again, blah, blah. This hasn't been good for years, blah, blah. And then some people who just love it because the politics is with them. And then under this one, it was just, oh, my God, the first time I've laughed out loud at late night with Stephen Colbert for years. And it's like, I don't believe you. What I believe is that somebody said something you want to believe or that you agree with, and now you're coming across to it and finding it amusing because actually it's sort of clapter. You're saying what I agree with, and therefore I'm going to say that I found it funny. I think that's what's going on there. Let's close up. I've got a few comments that we might want to look at. So we talked about AB's comment. Samuel says people mostly only care about truth when they think it supports their ideological narrative. And I think that's true. We talked about motivated reasoning.
I have a better term actually for that.
Go on.
It's called social reasoning. Our reasoning skills evolve to better fit into the tribe that we are part of. And this explains so much better what we now understand as motivated reasoning. So our reasoning skills can be very good in certain areas and completely fail in others. And this always has to do with our social environment. So our reasoning is actually social reasoning. It evolved to be good to fit into the tribe and not to be good at finding the truth.
And this probably feeds into not only in that case, but why some scientists are like, oh God, lab leak is really important, but I don't really want to stick my neck out and piss off all the other scientists, and I just keep my head down. So we see this.
Good reasons why not to look deeper into it, maybe.
Yeah. We see that quite a lot. Chris says that the Wade article was in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. That's right. That's exactly right. I thought it was nuclear physics or something. It was the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which struck me, like I say, as very odd. Suggests that you couldn't get it into somewhere more reputable.
Yeah, I think that. And the other thing is, I think that a good aspect of that article, not to only say that it was bad, I think a good aspect is that it kind of brings more to light the existential risk that we face from technologies like gain of function research, and we have to bring this to the forefront of attention. And maybe that's the reason why the bulletin that usually works with existential risks, why they thought this article still has some value, because in the end, biotechnology is an existential risk for society, as are atomic bombs as are artificial intelligence and a whole host of other things.
I'm probably being slightly unfair. There's probably some more clear reasoning as to why they thought it was an appropriate article. Final comment. A couple of people asking about Brett Weinstein, what are his views on this, and he seems to think that it's more likely, he's putting his probability on it, more likely of coming from the institute. I'm not sure about Brett Weinstein. Obviously a very clever guy, someone who, seemed to say very sensible things early on when he first sort of came out with the evergreen stuff. Mm-hmm. I just see some of the stuff he says, and sometimes I just think, what the hell are you talking about? And I don't know if maybe his revenue's on the line, or he's got in with a certain audience who he needs to sort of cater to. I remember you said some of the things you've seen him say on the biological side. You were just like, what's going on with this? I think he's gone anti-vax now, and he's taking ivermectin and just sort of jumped into a lot of these faddy things.
So this is a bit. So I think we're a feature of our environment, right? And what information sources we're fed. I think that he's a rational person. He has clear thinking and very good ideas in certain areas. But sometimes when smart people are wrong, they are fantastically wrong. And I think I think this is something that can happen. And this is why it's so dangerous to trust the person that is right or very smart about a particular thing in all other aspects as well. I mean, that's always the danger, right? Because we humans, we are not as consistent as we think we are. I mean, I'm very confident talking about genetics and stuff, but there are areas where I think I know exactly what's going on, and then just because I haven't heard all the points that are going against it. And
we'll get you on to talk about particle physics next time.
Oh God.
There's one final comment then. So he said the reason that he thinks it's more likely, and this is one of the arguments we're going to get into in a later video, but he says that that it's got the ability to infect human cells and be very transmissive. Now, we were discussing this yesterday, and I think the problem here is it's almost a religious argument. It's almost an argument you'd have heard against Darwin from the church in the 19th century. This thing looks designed because it's highly transmissive, highly infective, but it sort of couldn't have been otherwise. Otherwise, it wouldn't have got into the humans. How do you feel about this argument that the virus is so transmissive and so infective that it must have been designed? Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of this survivorship bias that we see, right? When there's a long process of unlikely or incremental steps, right? And then we only see the final product, we're like, I cannot imagine how this could have ever gotten there. But that doesn't mean that there's some magic or some engineering or anything else involved. Sometimes, giving a virus enough time and enough chances to develop life forms, the weirdest things. I mean, look at the diversity we have out there, right? And some of these diverse things we have out there evolved recently or quickly. Mm-hmm. So it's amazing how the space of possibilities is just amazing if you think about life and what it can do and take. And we constantly underestimate how much nuance there is. And that's why sometimes for us, I think that the phrase is, just because we lack the imagination of how it could have happened doesn't mean that there is something sinister going on.
I think Dawkins calls it the argument from personal incredulity. Just because I don't understand it doesn't mean that something magical happened. I think you're right with the survivorship bias. So we were talking about this yesterday. If the zoonotic jump is correct, and this virus, or the progenitor of it, was circulating in, let's say, pangolins, probably not going to be pangolins, but let's say it was circulating in pangolins, and those pangolins have something that cleaves furin, well then, of course, the virus developed to cleave furin. And it's not in the least bit surprising that when it jumped into humans, it has a furin cleavage site, which a lot of other viruses have.
This was the original hypothesis from everybody in the scientific community. It was, okay, it's a zoonotic jump. It transfers well in humans already. We have to find the intermediate animal because clearly from the bat to the human doesn't explain it. That's why we were starting to look for the intermediate animal and not bats from day one, because they knew in order to have these adaptations to be transferred, to be pandemic in humans, it has to have some other host animal that was a bit closer to us than bats are, so that this zoonotic jump with that transmissibility happened easier.
So in terms of the zoonotic hypothesis, the reason it looks so designed in humans is because it spent presumably a lot of time in a pangolin or some other mammal, which has helped it to adapt to more mammalian physiology. And therefore, under that hypothesis, it's not in the least bit surprising that it has a furin cleavage site or that it is particularly transmissible or infective in mammals. Because we see with SARS-CoV-2, it infects cats, dogs, snow leopards, pangolins, all sorts of other things. So I think you're right. You look at the end product and you don't see the filtering mechanism that's happened. You see the raw material for evolution, which is the mutations, but you miss the filtering mechanism of natural selection. So if you were to pick cards randomly out of a pack, yes, it looks like, oh my God, how did I get to a royal flush? But if you realize that there's a filtering mechanism of hand values, then okay, if you want to win, then you need a good hand. And then it becomes not so much of a mystery. Philip.
And one more thing, just to finish this. As a geneticist, I also have to say that, humans and evolution work very differently. When we humans design, if we would have designed this virus in any shape or form, we would have acted very differently and we would have introduced very different things because we follow different logic when we do these things than evolution does, right? Evolution just, has different constraints than we have in our design. Our design constraints are what techniques do we have and what knowledge do we have, right? Evolution doesn't have these constraints. It has the constraints of what is, most likely to do certain things. So it's a very different way. And so looking at the viral genome of SARS-CoV-2, if it was indeed engineered, I think there would be no way we wouldn't be able to tell. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there because I know you have have something to run off to as
well.
Yeah,
I have to run off.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to go through that with me. We've had some excellent comments in the chat as well. I'm going to talk to you more about that, Philip. You've told me a lot about that this week. There's going to be more videos going into some of those specific topics. Does the furin cleavage site mean that it's definitely engineered? These kind of things, breaking down some of those arguments, putting some probabilities to them, hopefully. Hope you guys have enjoyed that stream, and we'll do another one soon. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Sam.
Good stuff, buddy. I enjoyed that. Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, it was great.